Namaste and welcome to Pods by PEI, a policy discussion series brought to you by Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. I am Pragati Karki, and in today's episode, we have PEI colleague Anurag Acharya in conversation with former Indian diplomat Pankaj Saran on navigating India's diplomatic landscape and insider view. Pankaj Saran is a former diplomat. He has served as India's ambassador to Russia and India's High Commissioner to Bangladesh, and as the head of the Northern Division in Ministry of External Affairs dealing with Nepal and Bhutan. He has worked in different capacities with successive Indian Prime Minister in the Prime Minister office, contributing to decision-making at the highest level in a diverse range of sectors, including foreign affairs and national security. Pankaj is presently a convener of NatStrat, a Delhi-based independent center for research on strategic and security issues. He is a member of National Security Advisory Board and a distinguished fellow of the National Maritime Foundation. Anurag and Pankaj explore the evolution of India's foreign policy from the perspective of the former diplomat himself. They cover recent historical landmarks from the tectonic shift in the global geopolitics during the Cold War end to India's strategic maneuver amidst the complexity of the Indo-US nuclear deal to explore how each shaped India's foreign policy. With a keen focus on India's contemporary aspiration on the global stage, they explore the significance of forums like BRICS and India's hosting of G20 summit in shaping its foreign policy priorities. As Pankaj candidly shares his experience, the conversation also uncovers a unique insight into the high-stake, high-octane life of a diplomat. We hope you enjoy the conversation.
Namaste, I'm Anurag Acharya.
Namaskar, my name is Pankaj Saran. Thank you.
Welcome to the conversation, Ambassador Saran. Let's start the conversation with your personal journey into the foreign service. Why did you decide to join and how was your initial journey?
Well, firstly, thank you very much, Anurag, for hosting me here at your podcast. It's a great privilege to be here and talk to you. It's interesting. I mean, I really didn't plan to join the foreign service as such. I was very enamored, though, of the whole world of international diplomacy because I happened to live close to the diplomatic enclave in Delhi. And as a college student, I would go there almost every day and I would see those flags flying and those beautiful buildings. And I realized that, there is something about this whole atmosphere which is so appealing. And then just the charm and the adventurism involved of discovering other countries, other cultures, and also being able to then not only work in the traditional sense, but also to do some intellectual pursuits and understand other cultures and what makes the world the way it is. So these were basically what drove me to the foreign service. I must say I had a very romantic view of the world and of the job. I just thought it was an extremely cushy and a very privileged job. But I was somehow attracted to the whole job description, if I can put it like that, because it seemed to me to combine travel, intellectual pursuit, analysis, writing, scholarship, and also in the process helping your country and bringing the world closer to your country. Although as a young college kid, it was not as if one had some very fixed notions about national interest, which I have today. So it was more of a discovery and an adventure. So that's, I think, why and how I got into this. Luckily, we have a very rigorous examination. And I was fairly casual about it, to be honest. And I gave the exam and I always had internalized the fact that it's a very difficult exam. And if you get in, it's good. I'll consider myself lucky, fortunate. But if I don't, I'll do something else. So it was not as if it was a make or break, to be honest.
Sounds quite fascinating. I mean, during your career spanning of 4 decades, you've been assigned several high-profile jobs, including in Russia and in Bangladesh. You've also headed the MEA's North Division that looks at Nepal and Bhutan. But tell us about your personal experience during these assignments and how it shaped your worldview as a diplomat. You were just, mentioning about, how you stepped in to the foreign service, not understanding the entire gamut of things that you were up for. But tell us how it actually shaped your worldview as a diplomat.
Yeah, I realized very early on that the profession of diplomacy and the world of diplomacy was a very, very tricky and a very complicated universe. It required a very different and very specific skill sets, which you had to acquire to be a successful diplomat. And then the question would always arise in my mind, what is a successful diplomat? Who is a successful diplomat? And what does success mean in diplomacy? And I grew as I progressed over the last, let's say, 4 decades, starting from a young diplomat. So as a young diplomat, I would simply observe seniors and how they conducted negotiations. And not just negotiations, even the simple act of how you dress, how you speak, how you engage other people. So it starts from the most rudimentary, simple tasks and activities to the more complicated jobs of negotiating agreements, treaties, etc. So in the initial years, my first assignment was Moscow. I began from Moscow. We had to learn Russian. So
Must be quite intimidating.
it was, I landed, I still can never forget, January of 1984. So we're talking 40 years ago. And it was minus 25. I didn't even have an overcoat when I landed. And I remember it was pitch dark and all that we saw was 2-3 feet of white snow. So it was a white city. And the language was alien. And the whole thing looked, in a sense, unreal. And the question was, how do you communicate? How do you find your way to the market to do your basic personal affairs? But then as I walked into the embassy for the first time, and we had a beautiful heritage embassy, it was another world where, you saw people sitting quietly in their chambers, going about their business, immersed in their papers and their analysis and their study. And the whole thing looked very intimidating. But then, things began to improve. You started moving around, traveling around. And if I can fast forward to when I became a mid-level diplomat and, of course, finally as ambassador to Russia, which was my last ambassadorial assignment. So it was quite an emotional journey that began in Moscow and ended in Moscow. But it was a different country because I began in the
And you must have been a different diplomat.
Yeah, I was, battle-hardened. I don't know whether I was wiser, but certainly more battle-hardened, more bruised, more experienced. And before that, I was High Commissioner to Bangladesh.
I always tell my friends that I walked into my IR lectures as an idealist and I walked out as a thorough realist. I can imagine what it must have been for you.
Yeah, it's completely different. When you get into the business of diplomatic affairs, you realize that the appearances of, let's say, comfort and luxury and lifestyle are only that much. Underneath all that surface lies a very, very intense struggle to defend your country's interests and to promote your country's interests. And you are pitted against the best in the business. So the battlefield is actually, that's what I would call it, is flat, is equal, because it's one man against another man. And it all depends at the end of the day on individual skills and what makes a negotiation successful or a failure. And then when you look back, you do recall that some things which you did really were successful or you were proud of doing. And the second thing, of course, is you graduate in this business because in the initial stages, you're the backroom boy. You're not in the camera lights. You are doing the real hard work, the spade work. But as you kind of evolve and grow into the career and move up in the ladder, then the cameras begin to look at you. And then you have no one to look back at. It's you and nothing else. So the responsibility of what you say, what you do, how you act, how you craft policy, how you report back to your capital, how you implement directions from your capital. These all become very, very critical. But, briefly, I mean, the job description of the Indian ambassador to Russia and the Indian High Commissioner to Bangladesh were like the North Pole and South Pole. Bangladesh was a completely different, and I spent 7-8 years in that country over 2 periods. It was a completely different set of challenges. We can talk about it. And Moscow was a very, very different set. So you also realize how your country is positioned in different capitals of the world. In certain capitals, you could be a dominant player because of various reasons. Whereas in some capitals, you're just one among many. But I found that over a period of time, as India grew in stature, as an Indian diplomat, you definitely had more of a role to play. You were counted more. You had a greater visibility. And therefore, the job became even more challenging and interesting.
Yeah, that's quite a fascinating description, and thank you for that personal sharing of experience. I'm sure foreign service aspirants in our own country will also be benefiting from that point. Now, allow me to take the conversation to the year when the Cold War ended, and probably you were also young and new to foreign service then. After the Soviet disintegration, the global political landscape sort of changed, and so did India's economic and political worldview, especially vis-a-vis United States and Russia. And professionally, you started your career in the foreign service during the final years of the Cold War, and have had a ringside view to this tectonic shift in the global and South Asia's regional geopolitics. Tell us about the deliberations that led to such a shift in India's foreign policy, and what it meant for Indian diplomat posted not just yourself but across the world.
Yeah, no, thank you. This is a really interesting question, and it brings back many memories for me. In terms of India's deliberations that went on in India and what it meant for Indian diplomats, let me take the first part. To be honest, India was a recipient and kind of a rule taker. We were not a rule shaper. We were not a country which was actually influencing these global events. When I joined the Foreign Service and my generation, for us, the most important global capital was Moscow, because the most important relationship India had was with the Soviet Union. And we had the Indo-Soviet Treaty of 1971. That was in some sense the strategic anchor for India. So and this was during the Cold War, but when the Cold War ended, it ended abruptly. It ended without a single shot being fired. There was no military conflict. It actually ended because of the collapse of the Soviet state, the emergence of Mikhail Gorbachev as General Secretary. So for us, it was a huge setback, strategically speaking, because the stability and the security that we had taken for granted from the Soviet Union had disappeared overnight. So it was a strategic setback, and we had to go back to the drawing board to find out what do we do. Because that was the period in which our relationship with the United States and the West was very strained. I remember we had just gone through 1971, where the United States and India were exactly on the opposite sides of the whole situation. The United States had a military alliance and an extremely close relationship with Pakistan. China was somewhere in the middle. So the deliberations in India essentially related to how do we contain the damage and what do we do. So that was one aspect. But the second aspect was that at the same time, I mean, we're talking now 1991, was the year in which the Indian economy collapsed. And we were forced to mortgage our gold reserves to the IMF because we had run out of foreign exchange. We were in the thick of an economic crisis. And again, out of compulsion, just as in the case of the disintegration of the Soviet Union, we had no choice but to embark on a huge economic reforms process, basically to dismantle the license Raj that we inherited from the British. So we had two parallel processes going on, an internal crisis and an external crisis. So the period of the 90s, the whole decade, was a very difficult period. And on top of the economic crisis, we had a huge political crisis in India. We had successive governments coming in for 12 months, 13 months. So there was a lot of political instability. So all this meant that was a time for India to regroup at a global level, lie low, just kind of pick up the pieces and try to rebuild India, both internally and externally. So for diplomats outside, Indian diplomats who were posted outside, we were all busy making sense of what was going on. And that was the time when thinking began in India that maybe we needed to have another fresh look at our relationship with the West. Because remember at that time, when we went to the IMF and to the World Bank, etc., these are all institutions controlled by the West. So unless and until you did not have a certain relationship with the West, you would not get the kind of help that you needed. So that, I think, began that decade of the 90s, saw a recalibration or the beginnings of a recalibration away from the Soviet Union, away from Moscow towards the West.
Do you have a personal experience of that time that you can share, when all this happened and this conversation that you were talking about? Can you share some of your personal experience?
Yeah, I mean, of course, I was in the Prime Minister's office for 5 years. So I saw 5 different prime ministers come, say, for periods of 12 months each, coalition governments. It all to give credit to the Indian bureaucracy and the Indian institutions. They managed to run the country despite these frequent changes. I, of course, was not in Russia at that time. I was back in Delhi. But we went through a very difficult period. There were political assassinations in India. Each one of us tried to put in our best to make sure that we contributed to strengthening the nation. And there was confusion. I mean, I remember I was also posted in Washington in the early 90s. And again, that period was a period in which India was going through a huge problems in Punjab because of the Khalistan issue and Kashmir. And I was assigned to the congressional hill, to the Capitol Hill, as part of the embassy's outreach to the US Senate and the Congress. And I remember as a young diplomat walking the corridors, trying to convince and meet staffers, young staffers, and trying to explain to them what was happening in India, because in the Congress, India was facing a very, very difficult time. There was a huge pressure on India on the human rights issues, a lot of hostility. And so my job was to go and explain to the staffers. And India was not so visible on the US radar at that time. So to explain to them what India is, what was Punjab, what was Kashmir, to explain what was happening, why it was happening, the role of Pakistan, we were basically with our backs to the wall. So every day I'd come back from the hill to the embassy, report back to the ambassador. And, we used to have these almost strategy sessions every day, what to do. Because every day was a new challenge and a new situation where you would get hit or attacked by one congressman or the other. And we had very few supporters in the Congress who were ready to stand up and speak for India. So that of course, I certainly remember.
Yeah, I mean, another significant year for India's post-Cold War foreign policy is the year 2005, when India signed a historic civil nuclear agreement, also known as Indo-US nuclear deal. There was obviously a context to that deal on the American side, which had entered into what it calls a war on terror after the 9/11 attack. But tell us, how did India approach this deal, and how did it contribute to New Delhi's now strong relationship with Washington, compared to, what you just described earlier?
Yeah, so I think we can continue from where I left off. I talked to you about the turbulent times of the early 90s in the India-US relationship, and then you entered what was called the unipolar moment. The Soviet Union had disappeared. There was only one single global power, which was not very friendly to India. So in the period leading up to 2005, you also had another development. You had Vladimir Putin take over as the president of Russia in the year 2000. And that was the beginning of the rejuvenation of the Russian nation. But by the time we reached 2005, already, as I said, because of the assistance we got for our economic reforms from the West, and also remember there was another event which took place, which was not just 9/11, which was 2001, but in 1998, India went nuclear. And when India went nuclear, the relationship with the United States broke down. We were put under sanctions. We were literally, it was much worse than the early 90s, which I described to you. But the fact is that the Indian government of that day decided with open eyes to go nuclear. So we had a situation where we were complete at loggerheads with the Western world, including Japan, Canada, the United States, everyone else. And this is a remarkable twist of how global events can turn around in such a short time. So from this moment to 2005 was a dramatic turn. And 2005 and the events leading up till 2008, when the civil nuclear deal was negotiated, it took 3 years, negotiated, that was the foundational transformation of the India-US relationship. So from adversaries, from suspicious partners, uncomfortable partners, we actually moved into a very different terrain of being strategic partners. And the United States, the same country which had sanctioned us, which was pillaring us on human rights and everything else, actually led the world to lift the nuclear apartheid against India, despite our nuclear explosions, enabled us to lift all the sanctions against us, enabled us to get the technology we needed, and in a sense, brought India back into the mainstream of the nuclear system and access to technology. Now, of course, there are many reasons why this happened, but it was a leap of faith for both the Indian government under Prime Minister Manmohan Singh and successive US presidents, George W. Bush, and of course, before that, Bill Clinton had begun the process. So this is the whole saga where you literally challenged yourself, but you believed. I mean, there were actors out there, Condoleezza Rice, her president, on this side, Manmohan Singh, Natwar Singh, and all these people who actually believed that you could actually do this. There was a lot of resistance from within the Indian system, from within the American system, but the only reason why the deal succeeded and happened was because of the push from the White House and the PMO in India. Because the ministries and the bureaucracies were generally opposed and were very uncomfortable. So this, I think, marks the turnaround.
Now, despite its growing global standing, India's relationship in its own neighborhood remains quite frosty. A major reason for this, from where I see it, is due to India's boundary disputes with its neighbors, particularly with China. Do you feel New Delhi's close partnership with Washington, especially through Quad, has further complicated its relationship with Beijing? You talked about the Indo-US nuclear deal and right up to the Indo-Pacific strategy and Quad. I ask this because in September 2014, India rolled out red carpet to Chinese President Xi Jinping and signed several MOUs that promised to bring in Chinese investments to India. What followed in the next few years were not Chinese MNCs landing in New Delhi, but the troops of the two countries clashing in Doklam Tri-Junction and in Galwan Valley. How did it come to this?
Yeah, so there are many questions and ideas in your questions, which I'd like to unpack a little bit one by one, if you allow. So, firstly, I would not agree that India's relations with the neighbors is frosty. I think we made huge progress in terms of the relationships with our neighbors, particularly in the last 10 years. Today, the level of integration that we have in our subcontinent is far higher than it has ever been since, let us say, 1971 or 1965. So there's been massive progress. You know, you're aware of the energy pipelines, the highways, the civil flights. I mean, there's a whole world out there which is happening, and this integration is for real. So, yes, there are moments where we have tensions with our neighbors, but that is to be expected, because when two sovereign nations interact and are close to each other, there would be areas and moments of difficulty, but we have to get over those because, in my view, we have no choice but to live together for now and forever. But we believe that the neighborhood first policy, and I myself actually was deeply involved in different neighbors of India, and we really believe that we have to have a good relationship because that is the kind of starting point. So that's on the neighborhood, and I think we've done well, but I do admit there have been moments, including with Nepal, which have created difficulties.
We will talk more about Nepal and neighborhood later, but I'm talking about the border disputes between India and China.
So on China, look, this thing goes back to the McMahon Line. I mean, to the Chinese occupation of Tibet, because China was never India's neighbor. India's neighbor was Tibet. It was only when it became the People's Republic of China, when the communist takeover of Beijing and the integration of Tibet, that China became a neighbor of India. And the McMahon Line actually divided British India from Tibet. So the boundary issue is not so much a dispute over boundary as a dispute or a difference of perceptions of where the boundary lies. So we had the war with China in 1962, and after that we've had many discussions with them on the alignment of the line of actual control, and we've had many mechanisms with China on how to address the boundary question. In 1988, Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi visited, and that was the first visit of the Prime Minister, and the compact was that we will maintain peace and tranquility on the border, for which we arrived at several agreements with China. And the idea was that till you settle the boundary, we will maintain peace and tranquility. And we will continue with the rest of the relationship, political relationship, economic relationship, cultural relationship, etc., as two normal states.
And that pact held until the turn of the century. I think things began to go south after 2013-14, especially after 2014. I mentioned how when Prime Minister Narendra Modi came to power, he rolled out red carpet to Chinese. Several MOUs were signed, and then next couple of years you have Doklam, you have Galwan Valley. And how did it come to that?
Yeah, no, but look, we had a huge issue in 1986 in Sondorongchu Valley. We had a problem in 2013. So it doesn't start from 2014. There were problems with China which predate the Modi government. The Modi government, when it assumed office, made all efforts, like you have mentioned, to establish a modus vivendi with China. The Prime Minister Modi and his counterparts met many, many times in Delhi, in China, in other capitals to try and... So the question, I would put it like this. In my assessment, in my opinion, China is in many ways responsible for driving India closer to the United States. China doesn't view it like this, but that is the truth. If China were to be able to, as a bigger power, as an aspirant global power, be able to conduct a relationship and form a relationship with India, which is based on accepted principles of international law, and give respect to India's concerns, and to show by its actions, not just by words, that it recognizes India's aspirations as an emerging country in the Indo-Pacific region, then our relationship would be very different. But the Chinese actions have actually been exactly the opposite, and they have created insecurity in New Delhi, in India, that has accelerated India's shift towards the United States. As I told you, India and the United States have always historically had very difficult relationships. So it was not a natural movement by India towards the United States. So in 2020, which was the last big kind of standoff, the Chinese had about 150 or 200,000 troops on the line of actual control. We lost 13 soldiers. That was the biggest and the bloodiest clash on the boundary with China. That, I think, was a moment in which China, I would say, lost India, both in terms of public opinion and in terms of its foreign policy options. So we have to be very clear what was the action and what was the reaction. The Quad didn't come before 2020. Everything has to be seen in the cycle of life, the way one action generates another. And India has the full right as a nation, it has to protect its interests. So it has to find partners, it has to increase its own national power. So I would say that if you want to look at the India, China, United States triangle, it's a complicated triangle. A lot of the onus for today's situation rests on China. China has to return back to the status quo prior to 2020. It has to adhere to the agreements on peace and tranquility, which it violated, and because of which we've had many rounds of modern negotiations at the official level since 2020. So if we have a situation where China accepts that they have to return back and maintain peace and tranquility and go back to the original arrangements, then we can have a normal relationship with China.
Well, it's a very interesting relationship. The political and diplomatic side of a relationship remains very tensed, whereas economically, I think the trade between India and China keeps on increasing. But we'll not talk about that. Talking about boundary disputes, I want to talk about how Nepal also has an ongoing boundary disputes with India, which has also created tensions in the bilateral relationship. In the recent years, we've had a long conversation over it with Ambassador Ranjit Ray in our podcast back in 2022. So I will not go too much into it. But let me ask you about India's historical land boundary agreement in 2015 with Bangladesh, which ended decades of dispute on the eastern borders. You were heavily involved in shaping the outcome of that agreement. You were in office then. You were posted in Bangladesh. Take us through the complex journey of confidence building and negotiations and how two sides reached that agreement, given the state of affairs between Nepal and India on the boundary disputes. What lessons could such an agreement hold for Nepal and India?
Yeah, Anurag, this is a long story, so I'm not going to get into. I'll just, make only a couple of observations. Number one, the success of that land boundary agreement was an outcome of the political will on both sides. You had an alignment of political leaderships in Dhaka and New Delhi, which enabled this to happen. Number two, the political leaderships in both capitals or both countries were fully empowered. They didn't have to look back, because in India you had a majority government, a strong, stable government. Similarly, in Dhaka you had a strong, stable government. That was the second thing, where you have not just the will, but you have the capability of addressing difficult issues. And number three, I think there was an enlightened understanding that we were both, Bangladesh and India, the victims of some other people's mistakes. We were the outcome of mistakes made by the British. And there was no reason for us to continue that colonial hangover. So the first agreement, again, was signed between Indira Gandhi and Sheikh Mujib in 1974, again at the high point of the India-Bangladesh relationship. And that agreement consisted of 3 parts. I won't go into that. But guess what? That time you had, again, good leadership, strong leaderships, yet was that enough? It wasn't enough for implementation. You had the first agreement in 74, and then nothing happened for 30, 40 years because of the fact that both countries went in different directions. And then in 2011, finally, you actually did a survey, you had a protocol which defined how you would solve the issue. The basic principle, there were many issues, but the most important was the exchange of enclaves. So there were these pieces of territory inside Bangladesh, cut off from the Indian mainland, which were Indian territory, and you had pieces of territory inside India, which were actually Bangladeshi territory, but cut off from Bangladesh. So the agreement was, it's one of those most unique agreements in diplomatic history, where both sides agreed that we will not count the area that you lost or gained. We will not go down arithmetic or on a piece of paper calculate the square kilometers. We will be more humane. We will be more statesmanlike. What we will do is, whatever enclaves of India that exist in Bangladesh, Bangladesh can keep them. And the sovereignty of those enclaves will be transferred from India to Bangladesh. We will count them, we will add their areas, we will add the populations, but we will not do some balancing. Similarly, the Bangladeshi enclaves in India, which were Bangladeshi territory, will be absorbed into the Indian Union and become Indian territory. And secondly, went even beyond that. We will not insist on any transfer of population. So the populations who are living in those enclaves, which are actually Indian inside Bangladesh, we said we'll give them a choice. You want to come back to India? You're welcome. But you want to continue in Bangladesh because you've been living there for 70 years, 80 years? You're welcome to be Bangladeshi. And similarly on this side. And guess what? When we finally actually exchange the enclaves with the sign of a paper, with that agreement, on one fine day, on the appointed day, all the Indian enclaves in Bangladesh became Bangladeshi territory. All the Bangladeshi enclaves in India became Indian territory. There was no transfer of population because the people said, we are happy where we are. So till yesterday, an Indian citizen became a Bangladeshi citizen. And similarly, on the Indian side, he was Bangladeshi, but he became Indian. And yes, there was some, loss and gain. But the remarkable thing was that it happened peacefully. I was personally involved in the exchange of people. We were worried, will there be migration? Are we going to see another replay of 1947? Nothing happened. Nothing. So today, it has been so good for the poorest of the poor because that's what they were. Small villagers, landless labor, the most deprived, voiceless. And that was the beauty of this agreement. It was a fantastic example of how two countries, neighboring countries, with the most complicated, a simple thing in a border is, okay, you hold my territory, I hold. But what about an enclave, which is like 100 kilometers away from the border? And imagine those people who were living in that enclave, and there were thousands, in some enclaves there were thousands of them, in some there were maybe 70, 80,000, in some there were maybe a few hundred. Though these people were stateless. So I think it was a great example, and it happened, as I said, because of the domestic situations and the alignment of stars. And Manmohan Singh's government tried to do it. I was part of that effort also. It failed. It was the Modi government which succeeded because he came into office in 2014. He did it in 2015, in 1 year. And this was supposed to be a right-wing, anti-Muslim kind of government, this, that. But he understood the strategic importance and the political importance. And after doing it, he visited Bangladesh. I was there as Prime Minister of India, and it was a hugely successful visit. He was greeted with open arms. It was a celebration. And people looked at him and said, you have solved what could not be solved since 1947.
It's quite a fascinating description, and most importantly, it resolved decades of dispute between the two countries. Now, let's move the conversation from India's challenges to India's achievements. Despite difficulties in the neighborhood, India's global outreach in the last decade has increased significantly. What has been the hallmark of Indian foreign policy pursuit in the last decade, especially vis-a-vis US, Russia, and West in general?
Yeah, I think the hallmark, if you were to ask me, of the policy has been to be more ambitious, to be more risk-taking, and to have a vision for the future. So whether you look at our relationship with the United States or with Russia, or in the early days even with China or with other countries, we significantly accelerated the pace and the content of each of these relationships. We shed the inhibitions or the hesitations that were marking our policies in the past. So we decided and we chose to see what is it that India needed from each of these partners. And once you have arrived at that kind of a assessment or a determination, then the view was go for it. Because time is not on your side. Because if you want to transform the country, you have to have these kind of very, very intense relationships. So as we just discussed the US relationship, a little bit on the Russia relationship. The Russia relationship under Putin from 2014 also proceeded at a fair pace. There were frequent meetings, annual summits between Prime Minister Modi and President Putin. There was healthy interaction in all areas, including military, etc. Similarly, with Europe, we moved forward significantly. But a lot of this was possible because, as I said again, of the political stability inside India and the very authoritative and kind of stable leadership provided by the Prime Minister himself. I mean, remember, this was someone who had been denied a US visa when he took office. So you had a situation where the Indian Prime Minister actually had been denied a visa to enter the United States. And so the first visit overseas that he made was to the United States. So all things have happened. We have seen a lot of things happen, unimaginable. So this was the hallmark, I would say, where national interest dominated personal interest. And there was this belief that India can and must also contribute to international institutions, to international global issues. On climate change, for example, India was always considered a naysayer, that an obstructionist, someone who would always say no. But in the last 10 years, we have shifted from being a naysayer to being a solution provider on climate and on global warming. And we have led the way in terms of green transition, in terms of renewable energies, etc. So there is a big fundamental shift. Similarly, on the civilizational personality of India, there is a greater confidence, self-confidence, that India has something to put on the table, and we will put it. There is also, when it comes to, say, challenges, security challenges that we pose, that we face, an equal candor that India will defend its security interests from wherever they are threatened. So I would say, all in all, this was the way in which foreign policy has been conducted, and obviously it's been successful. And therefore, there is a feeling in New Delhi that whatever you've done has actually worked for India.
I'm also looking at how India has interestingly sort of balanced between its relationship with the United States and Russia at a time when there is a kind of proxy war between the West and the Russia, especially due to ongoing Ukraine war. So how would you look at India's position in this very complicated landscape?
Yeah, it was difficult. I mean, to be honest, because
it remains challenging.
It remains challenging, and it tested India's diplomatic skills. It tested India's political leadership, because we had friendships and good relations with both sides, with Russia, with the United States, with Europe. We were friends with all of them. And there's huge stakes involved in each of these friendships. So the question was, what does India do? And I think what India chose to do was to avoid getting sucked into this proxy war through its diplomatic statements and other things. And we advocated a return to negotiation and diplomacy because the memories of the Cold War still remain. But at that time, we were much less powerful. We were more vulnerable. This time around, after 60 years, we have more self-confidence. So we said, listen, you have to solve this peacefully on the negotiating table, not on the battlefield. We did not condemn any party. We did not condemn Russia. The Prime Minister announced publicly this is not an era of war. And we have maintained channels with all sides of this conflict in terms of high-level contacts, in terms of hearing the concerns from both sides. And we believe this is the optimal path for India. Of course, it comes with a price. There were people on the Western side in the United States and Europe who were not happy with the Indian position. And there were similarly people on the Russian side who felt India should be more supportive of Russia. But this is a conscious decision taken, and I think it is a continuum of the larger strategic perspective that India kind of brings to bear on global issues and on the international system.
Now, one of the major agenda India has been raising at the global summits and gathering of world leaders in the recent years has been the issue of exclusion of Global South in the United Nations Security Council. In 2006, it joined Russia, China, and Brazil, with South Africa joining later in 2010, to create BRICS and challenge the established power of the West, the G7, in shaping global agendas. How significant has BRICS been to further India's own ambitions to take the global center stage?
Yeah, so again, I mean, on the Security Council and BRICS, I think these are two separate issues. On the Security Council, India's views are very well known. They've been repeated multiple times in multiple forums. We believe that the current Security Council is anachronistic. It is a creature of something that happened after 1945. As Foreign Minister Dr. Jaishankar wrote in his recent book, Why Bharat Matters, this is a classic example of freezing the moment. You took a moment in the march of human history and you decided that these five will be anointed as the permanent members of a small body which is mandated to preserve international peace and security. Clearly, that body has failed to discharge any worthwhile function. And secondly, it represents nobody. It does not represent the vast majority of mankind. And India, as the most populous country in the world and a growing economy, has to have a place in such a forum which represents the United Nations mandate and charter to govern international peace and security. So that position remains. Now, the question is, it has not happened yet, India's membership of the Security Council, and people in India are very realistic. They don't expect it to happen in the near future. But the point is, that does not take away from the Indian position that the Security Council is defunct. It has not been successful recently in Ukraine, nor in Gaza. It has not been successful in any venture at all. Now, on the BRICS issue, this is very much part of India's own image of itself, that it is not a lackey of the West. It is an old civilization, 5,000 years old. It brings its own characteristics to bear and its own mindset and its own perspectives on the global order. And Russia, China, South Africa are all big powers in their own regions. So the BRICS grouping was actually initially set up when it began with an economic agenda largely, not a political agenda. And in BRICS, while Russia and China were permanent members, and China, of course, opposes any expansion and blocks India's membership, both South Africa and India were demandeurs. I mean, both of us said, including Brazil, for example, that, it is high time that you listen to the rest of the world and they have to have a seat inside and a representation. And this issue came up most recently in the context of what India called the Global South. The Global South is a metaphor for those countries who developing and somewhat dispossessed from the international system. So Brazil, South Africa, India are on one side who want change, whereas Russia and China are on the other side, inside the Security Council. So I think India is interacting with the BRICS membership and the grouping. We participate, we try to make use of the grouping in ways that can help India. Let's say, for example, in the New Development Bank, India is one of the largest beneficiaries of their loans and grants. We also then can talk freely about the deficiencies of the current global order, which was actually a Western-led and a Western-created order. So we are able to talk about all these things. So the Indian footprint, if I can use that word, on global issues has expanded because of BRICS. And BRICS has led and enabled India to talk about different issues without fear or favor.
Now, continuing on the conversation about the Global South leadership, now India also hosted the 2023 G20 summit in New Delhi with an ambition of what Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar has framed as preparing India for the world and preparing the world for India. Where do you think India is headed after the G20 summit, especially in terms of its own foreign policy priorities on economy and security?
Yeah, so I think the G20 of 2023 was held under very, very difficult circumstances because of the Ukraine conflict, and the world was divided down the middle between the West and the rest, between the G7 and the G20, and the political standoff between Russia and the West was the worst it has ever been since the end of the Cold War, or it was the worst it has been since the Cold War. So the split, the vertical split in the globe was visible during the entire year of 2023 when India was chairing the G20. So it was a very, very challenging moment for Indian diplomacy because you had 2-3 choices. Either you to promote the G20 as a grouping of countries which was responsible for global economic and trade and financial issues. So if you failed, the G20 would simply kind of break up or become a toothless body, or it would become a victim of these political divisions. That was a danger, a real danger. So Indian diplomacy, led by the Prime Minister, exerted every sinew in its muscle to ensure that it brought all these two sides together. And finally, it did succeed. It had a communique, it had a consensus document, and finally the G20 came up with an agenda for the future. So this has given a lot of confidence to India, because if India could manage this, it means that the West allowed this to happen, and it also means that Russia and China also allowed this to happen. So in a sense, you can argue that all of them actually gave India this success. Because if even one of these parties had decided to play the spoiler, India would not have been able to show the success it did. So it's interesting how each of these powers and parts of the multipolar system enabled India to show this success. So that confidence which India has got, again, has given it the feeling that what it is doing is right. Nothing succeeds like success. So today, The second thing which India brought to the G20, when you talk about the future and the lessons, is that India was able to put things on the table which it could not do in the past. And what was that? That was to exhibit and showcase its own successes in its own economic and domestic transformation. Things like digital economy, digital public infrastructure, green transition, and many, many other approaches that India has successfully implemented within India. It also was able to talk about the global south and reflect the global south's positions on so many issues. So I think for the future, in a post-2023 G20 situation, you will find India being more active, more visible on global issues in each of these relationships, and leveraging its successes at home to contribute to global good and global stability.
We've had a fascinating conversation so far with regards to India's foreign policy pursuit over the past decade and its future ambitions. What does India's increased global standing mean for South Asia region, especially with regards to its neighborhood first policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, look, it is a given that for any country to be able to pursue its global ambitions, it actually has to have good relations with its neighbors. And what I can say is that if India grows fast, in a balanced manner, in an atmosphere of stability, within a democratic framework, all this will contribute to making a better neighborhood. It will open opportunities for the smaller neighbors to benefit from and to participate in this growth story. If I put it another way around, if you had a situation where India was not growing, was rife with internal disturbances, was unstable, or was a stagnant economy faced with myriad problems, we would all have suffered. So it is in the interest of the region that there is a growth pole, that there is an anchor of stability in the region. So I am convinced that India which grows in a healthy fashion, in a sustainable fashion, and in an inclusive fashion can actually lift, to use a Chinese metaphor, all the smaller boats around it in the ocean. That's what the Chinese say about their neighbors. And I think it applies equally to India's neighbors, that when the waves are rising, the small boats can also rise along with the wave. And that's the way we see it. The fundamental approach of the neighborhood first policy is prosper thy neighbor, not beggar thy neighbor, and to respect sovereignties, interests, allow neighbors the space they need to pursue their national interests as they see fit, and collectively grow and find the mechanisms, the creativities. I would say, for example, our relations with Bangladesh today and for the last 10 years or more, the kind of things that have happened would have been unthinkable 15 years ago. There's literally a revolution underway in the kind of connectivities and projects and things that India and Bangladesh have been able to do. So there are good examples, but I would also admit there are bad examples. But on the whole, I would say if India succeeds on the global stage as an emerging force for global good, that will definitely have positive externalities within the region.
Now, despite what you just claimed, globally we are also witnessing smaller states struggling to manage competing ambitions between big powers, including the United States and China. Now, in South Asia, we are already seeing this translate into domestic power political polarization. In countries like Nepal and Sri Lanka, we've seen that over MCC, and recently also in Maldives. As a resident power on the rise, what could India do to ensure such a competition does not have a spillover effect to destabilize the region? Or is India's preoccupation with its own interests vis-a-vis Indo-Pacific and Quad, or its differences against China and Pakistan too important to be distracted about what is happening in small neighboring states?
No, not at all. Not at all. I mean, this whole Indo-Pacific Quad, etc., is happening at a different level. I mean, that has got nothing to do with how India is approaching the neighborhood. I mean, the whole of South Asia is very much part of the Indo-Pacific region. So that, I think, has nothing to do with how India is. Yes, India definitely would not like power play and contestation to disrupt the normal flow of relationships in this region. We do not want disruptive forces or disruptive policies here. We respect small states, we respect their choices, and we respect their autonomy. After all these are three things which India itself has canvassed loudly on the global stage. So when it comes to the smaller nations in the South Asian region, absolutely, we stand by all these principles. Therefore, it is important for major powers, whether it's the United States or China or anyone else, to respect and give the same respect to these same principles which India is prepared to give. And what India is saying is that we don't live in a vacuum, we live in a real world. And that real world means real geography, real history, real civilizational connect, real cultural bonds. Any activity or power or force which seeks to disrupt and rupture any of these attributes which we have inherited over the last thousands of years is going to create more problems than do any good. And we have every right, therefore, to question the motives and the intent behind such activities. We do not want any adversarial or inimical power to come to the region to create disruptions. But at the same time, we respect the decisions of these smaller nations. And we will not force any of them to make choices which are unviable or unrealistic. Whether you are Nepal or you're India or you're Bhutan, we have to remember that every nation, till as long as we agree that the nation state is a piece on the geostrategic, is an entity recognized by law, international law, has the right and has security concerns and has the right to protect those security concerns. So it doesn't mean that large states do not have security concerns or interests. And if we have to live together, it is important that all of us, big and small, live in this compact where we respect each other's concerns and we promote each other's happiness and stability.
I would have loved to pick your brain on some of these issues, but I'm afraid we've run out of our allotted studio time. Thank you for this open and candid conversation, Ambassador Saran.
Thank you so much, Anurag. Pleasure to be with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks for listening to Pods by PEI. I hope you enjoyed Anurag's conversation with Pankaj Saran on navigating India's diplomatic landscape and insider view. Today's episode was produced by Nirjan Rai with support of Khushi Hang, Videsh Sapkota and me, Pragati Karki. The episode was recorded at PEI Studio and was edited by Videsh Sapkota. Our theme music is courtesy of Rohit Shakir from Zindabad. If you liked today's episode, please subscribe to our podcast. Also, please do us a favor by sharing us on social media and leave a review on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or wherever you listen to the show. For PEI's video-related content, please search for Policy Entrepreneurs on YouTube. To catch the latest from us on Nepal's policy and politics, please follow us on Twitter at tweet2PEI. That's tweet followed by the number 2 and PEI. And on Facebook at Policy Entrepreneurs Inc. You can also visit pi.center to learn more about us. Thanks once again from me, Pragati Karki, and we will see you soon in our next episode.